My goal this year is to read every #1 best-selling fiction and nonfiction book on Powell's best-selling rack in good old Portland, Oregon. It roughly changes out around once a quarter and is based on how many copies are being sold in the store. These were the #1 best-selling books in December 2023. All right. I know it says ACOTAR here, but I checked like 2 weeks before this, and it used to have A Winner's Promise in the first spot. They just did a little flip-flop. I love when bookstores make ranking shelves because it's so fascinating to see what's popular, what's capturing the minds of readers in this moment. My intention with this goal was to develop my reading palette, maybe read some things that I wouldn't have chosen to otherwise. So the first book on the fiction list is A Winter's Promise, and in previous videos, I might go over spoilers and stuff, but this video, we're not doing spoilers. I'm gonna try to say as much as I can without spoiling any details of this book, so it could be a recommendation for you. When I talk about certain details, it's gonna be a if you know kind of thing, you know what I'm saying? Like for those of you who have read it, you remember all that weird toilet stuff? Oh my gosh, crazy, right? Okay, well, let's talk about it. This is A Winter's Promise, the first book in a quartet of books written by Christelle Dabos. The author is French, meaning that she wrote this in French, and thus it was translated to English. But from the way it reads, I mean, I wouldn't know if it was translated or not. I don't think I'm experienced enough to pick out a bad translation, but I thought it was really well written. The prose felt good, nothing felt awkward, and it had an imaginative richness to it. Now, one of the most important temperature checks we can take for any book is the vibe check. The vibrature check. What are we getting here? Is this like a horse romance kind of book? Maybe it's a true culinary crime kind of novel, you know? Perhaps a fishing thriller? Those are good. I would say that this is a young adult high fantasy that has often been likened to something like Harry Potter. Now, I don't know if I'd go as far as to put them two together, but there definitely are some similarities for sure. They both center around protagonists that are, seem really ill-equipped at first, and then are swept up into a grand journey that they're unprepared for, and also features a pretty robust magic system. The world building is very vivid too, and unravels at a really good pace. If I'm gonna be honest though, I think the vibe of this book more closely resembles Studio Ghibli's Howl's Moving Castle than Harry Potter. I know. Comparisons to that movie are probably thrown around a lot. In fact, I even made that comparison for certain aspects of ACOTAR, but I do think it does apply here, and in a good way. The setting is post-apocalyptic in a way. The Earth has been shattered, and there are 21 remaining pieces of it, floating islands called arcs. These chunks of Earth hold a different climate and population of people with it, almost like the island is its own state or country. And while the setting is technically post-apocalyptic, it still retains the semblance of a Europe in like the 1800s. It reminds me of Howl's in that it has that European vibe with magic kind of embedded within the culture, and both including things like airships. Maybe it's more of like a Ghibli punk kind of vibe. Ghibli core. Oh, I know that's probably a thing. Regardless of the comparison, though, it didn't feel derivative. It just kind of had the energy of that kind of story, which is a good thing if you like Howl's. In this story, we follow Ophelia, a late teen girl who is very soft-spoken, pretty reserved, and also extremely clumsy. This is a fundamental part of her character, by the way. She's tripping all over the place, breaking things. Definitely makes you a little concerned that this is the protagonist we're following. This is who we're working with? Yeesh. While most people in this world are generally magical, there are some that have unique powers that stand above the rest. Ophelia has 2 powers. She can travel between mirrors that she has seen before. That's pretty freaking cool. And her second power allows her to read and look into the history of any object, which is also pretty freaking cool. With a power like this, she works with her quirky uncle in a museum. Ophelia's quiet and quaint lifestyle is suddenly at risk now when she is met with a proposal to a man named Thorn who comes from a different arc. An arc known for its brutality and history as warriors. Ophelia is consumed with dread, not only to the fact that her life is going to be radically changed, but also that this man seems really dangerous. He doesn't even seem to care for her. And while her mother is kind of stoked about this because Thorn comes from a family of nobility, just from the way Thorn's demeanor seems to suggest that there's something else going on underneath. And so the plot kicks off with Ophelia going to a different arc, one that is foreign to her, more cutthroat, much more dangerous to her, and with a man who doesn't seem like he cares for her in the slightest. Now, there are a lot of things to like about this book. Might be a little easy to pick out some of its inspirations, but it takes a lot of those elements and spices it up in its own way. It's got a rich world and a suspenseful plot. Now, I do want to talk about some things I enjoyed and didn't so much enjoy about this book. It's not perfect. There are some areas that are lacking, but in my opinion, the two best things that this book has to offer are its magic systems and its world building. In a day and age where it's a given that most stories these days feature superpowers to some degree, whether it's a superhero story or just a fantasy novel, this book does stand out by creating some powers and magic that are pretty interesting. It sticks out a little bit, just like a little hair that's, it's kind of out of place. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's definitely a little bit more refreshing than most superpower injected stories we get these days. Ophelia's powers of reading the history of an object is really interesting, and there's a lot of potential in that idea. She even has a family member who has the power to repair paper. That's it. She is strictly a paper healer. And so I think this book stands out and that it has, powers and magic that aren't strictly combative. And surprisingly, most of the book really doesn't involve the powers that much. The story does not hinge on putting these powers into action. The attention is more on the plot and characters rather than their cool abilities. And that, again, is kind of refreshing. It's almost like a little bit of a background detail. At the end of the day, I don't even really think that Ophelia used her powers more than just a few times. But they are still involved in the plot at large in a pretty foundational way. The world building is also a great strength of this book. It definitely has its own flavor and personality to it. Magic lives and breathes within this setting. It is like the underlying life force of this world. There are floating islands with populations built on them. Buildings are in a way alive, almost kind of like a plant or tree would be. There are bloodlines of people that carry unique kinds of magic. And a lot of the times these powers dictate your vocation. While we only get certain glimpses of what's contained in this world, it certainly feels pretty well realized. Also, I'm just going to say right now, I have no idea why this book is called A Winter's Promise. Maybe it's something lost in translation, or I'm just a poop brain and totally missed it, but I do not recall any significant promises, unless you count the engagement. Okay, I guess so. And I don't even think it technically takes place in winter. Whatever. There's a lot about this book that I really enjoyed. Sure, there are some obvious inspirations from things probably like Harry Potter, maybe Studio Ghibli's, Howl's Moving Castle, but I think it still does have a great feel to it that sets it apart from its inspirations. The one thing I would say, however, that didn't quite grip me were the characters. To be honest, I didn't quite feel like the characters were really all that compelling to me. I can't quite put my finger on it. I think they're generally effective, but I think that they're not really more than what they are in the immediate situation. Did that make any sense? Let me try to explain. Ophelia has a mild amount of personality. Honestly, most of her personality is that she is extremely clumsy and kind of soft, bruises easily like a banana. She's like a little clumsy banana worming her way through the plot. And so really the only thing that I felt for her was that I just felt bad that she was in this continually developing situation that was just horrible. But I didn't quite feel compelled beyond that. She clearly doesn't deserve this crazy situation that's forced upon her in the plot, but at the same time, I'm not quite sure what she does deserve. I don't think I got a good sense of what she could have been if this horrible situation didn't happen to her. For Harry Potter, he's kind of got the opposite thing. He is brought up in a very horrible environment and circumstances, but then he is liberated from it once he finds out that he is not only a wizard, but he's one of the most chosen wizards to ever exist. The wizarding world is freedom for him, but there are also a lot of things that are constantly threatening his position in this world. There are bullies, antagonistic professors, even the murderer of his parents coming after him. In such a short amount of time, Rowling creates this character that we feel bad for, that we want to be liberated, and the rest of the book, or even the series for that matter, is him maintaining and finding his place within that world, among many other things. But I think that is the kind of thing that I lacked in this book. We're introduced to Ophelia pretty quickly, and then we immediately find out that, she has to be wed to this guy. I'm not sure if there was enough time for us to get to know her before she was just thrust into this plot. She doesn't really have a visible disposition of who she wants to be or who she could be, and how this plot will either push her towards or away from that. And that's not to say that she's like a poorly written character or anything. She's fine. But I could just tell after reading the book that I just didn't really think about her at all too much, or even the other surrounding characters for that matter. I've been really trying to pay attention to what I remember after reading the books, even weeks after the fact, because it might show me something that I didn't really think about at the time of reading. And in this case, I don't really think the characters did so much for me rather than the world that they're in. I think the world's very exciting and very rich. And in that way, the story's a little bit more plot driven and not so much character driven. Probably the thing that I appreciate the most in this book, though, is the way that this book slowly drip feeds you crucial details and information that slowly nuances this world. This book has a really good pace to it, but also restraint as well. well. I think it could often go under the radar how a story paces out information to you, especially in a fantasy setting when it's trying to world build. And I think this book is a really good example of doing that well. As you move through the first few chapters, there are many instances and like little details where you're kind of like, wait, what was that? What did you just say? Ophelia's scarf lovingly curled itself around her neck? What the heck is going on with the scarf, man? Doesn't address it or explain. But then a few chapters later, when we're getting a little bit more exposition about Ophelia, we then learn about how this scarf became sentient. Like I mentioned earlier, we find out pretty quickly that Ophelia is extremely clumsy. And after a few chapters, it gets to a point where like, dude, is any real human being this clumsy? Is it possible to actually be this clumsy? But then later, we actually find out a pretty interesting and valid reason for why she's like that. This is just a couple examples you'll see in the early chapters, but my point is that the book does a really good job at dropping you these little like pieces of information, and it makes you ask questions and think about it as the story progresses. And then at like a better and more sensible time, you kind of find out more about him as the story reveals itself to you. It doesn't just give you all these details and exposition up front. You just kind of have to like sit with it for things to simmer and start making a little bit more sense. And that is an example of pacing, but also restraint that I think goes over really well in this book. I constantly felt like I was learning more and more about this world, and it was never in a form of a gigantic exposition dump or anything. Davos does a really good job at moving you through the plot at a good pace, letting you get hooked by these, interesting things, and then colors things in slowly over time. It definitely made for a great momentum in this book, and I think it was one of my favorite things about actually reading it. At the risk of sounding like a centrist, I really enjoyed this book, but I also wasn't really blown away by it either. It is a vibe for sure, and if you're looking for vibes, this is a great pick. The world and its systems are really fascinating, but the characters didn't quite nail it for me. I'm definitely open to reading the next books in this series, especially now they're getting so popular. I could see the series going in some fun and interesting places. For a young adult, I think this is a great book. I'm not quite sure if there's anything profound to take from it, but it definitely is a fun and interesting journey. If I was younger and more of an adult, I think I would have liked this book like a lot. Definitely would have been stoked for the series. I mean, just look at that cover art. That is instant buy cover art right there. But now that I'm older and more childish, I don't know. I think maybe I need just something with a little bit more meat on its bones. Just a little bit more protein, Maybe something with just a little bit more probiotics, just to kind of get my gut in order. That said, I would recommend this book. It's a very solid fantasy book, and I think it sets up a lot that could go over well in the next installment. Is it a #1 book for me? Probably not, but I could definitely see why this book is really popular, especially with the YAs out there. For those of you who are reading along with me, thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I'd love for you to leave your thoughts on this book or any recommendations for others. I'll definitely try to keep you guys updated with a community post anytime there's a couple new books on the best-selling rack, so you can try to read along with me if you want. All right, that's it. That's it now. Goodbye. Have a good one. See you next time.